Why were early students of texts like the Sefer Yetzirah so concerned with multiplicity within the 10 Sefirot? To get an understanding, it helps to check in with other traditions that were also developing at the time. Alexandria was this Hellenized city with all these vibrant philosophers around a time where certain the Sefer Yetzirah had at least been written down. Philo of Alexandria was tailoring Jewish ideas for Greek thinkers at the same time Yeshua was said to be in Qumran. Now, Yeshua would have been a Jewish teacher at the same time, so what we're seeing is some of those early beliefs that would lead to the birth of rabbinic Judaism and early Christianities, right? But what were those beliefs? Give your servant, therefore, a listening heart to judge your people and to distinguish between good and evil. But who is able to give judgment for this vast people of yours? The wisdom of Solomon has become something of legend. While it's easy to get lost in the lore surrounding the wise king, I feel it's important to highlight where his reign begins. He didn't set out to build a great empire or become an archetype for future magi. The first thing Solomon did was ask God for a listening heart capable of leading his people. Listening to God is a cornerstone of Judaism, right? The fact that Solomon begins his reign by asking God for a willingness to hear God cannot be overemphasized. The Shema prayer may be one of the most recognizable prayers we know of today. The declaration in Deuteronomy 6:4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one," has become such an integral part of Jewish dedication that it's one of the first things taught to children. It's less prayer and more of an affirmation that God is the only thing there is in existence. It's recited morning and night, the world over, to this day. Now, a lot has been said in regards to the unity of God up to this point, but I want to turn your attention to the opening lines of the Shema. Hear, O Israel. To hear God is to obey God. To obey God is to hear God. But Israel's God wrestler, right? So there's that internal conflict. But Solomon understood that to truly lead his people wasn't to wrestle with God. His job was to listen, understand, and judge from a listening heart. The heart being the seat of divine wisdom. Right understanding relates to our human intellect being in line with the deeper wisdom of the divine. When we speak of humankind being created in the image and likeness of God, we're connecting logos, logic, and reason to Sophia, sound wisdom emanating from the divine. That's pretty much Philo in a nutshell. It's the oscillation of the macrocosm on a microcosmic scale. We are the manifestations of divine union coming into being to experience life. It's the wise who hear God's instructions and take action that are building on solid ground. No one builds their house on a rock of wisdom without understanding what a listening heart entails. Now, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed about by the wind. For the person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. James encouraging others to ask God for wisdom shows Solomon's listening heart was still respected and living well into the 1st century. For the Lord gives wisdom generously and without reproach, right? Hints of the gem Yeshua gave to Nicodemus take on the same image of spirit and water as it all comes together again in the Epistle of James. He associates doubtful people with the wave of the sea that is driven and tossed about by the wind. Remember, the Greek word for wind is pneuma, which also means spirit, just like Hebrew. It's one of those few spaces that loses none of its meaning in translation. Now, this is the same pneuma with the double meaning that we find in John. Wind is still spirit, and spirit is still understood, like consciousness is understood today. An unconscious mind will be tossed around by the deep waters of a subconscious soul. Double-mindedness is like this mental illness in some ways. We literally go against our own best interests, but this isn't a new idea. Zoroastrians left the footprint of Ahura Mazda and Ahriman deep in the sands of the Near East. Gnostic strands were banded together in every religious philosophy with their insistence on the flesh being wicked, right? Plato's receptacle became home for idea and matter in his school of thought. India developed Maya in the world of illusion. Atman and Brahman were also being used to describe the essential identity of self and ultimate reality. The 1st century was sideswiped with opposition, the kind of opposing forces the Sefer Yetzirah never named. Reason being, dualism requires tension to be, so all of these groups believe conflict is an essential part of life. Fighting with others and living like they're constantly at war inside are common side effects. Tension breeds strife and leads to the dis-ease of mind. Any kingdom that fights against itself will be destroyed. A family that is divided against itself will fall. We experience internal conflict when what we want goes against what we think we require. When we decide to take more than is needed, we tend to look for a weaker group to run over. The justifications we come up with tend to be survival. We develop justice systems, religious orders to enforce a moral compass so we can come together and make our survival easier. When any of us breaks our agreement and violate the needs of others out of selfishness, we are fighting against our kingdom. It's a self-destructive behavior we've engraved in our DNA, but it doesn't come from wisdom. It comes from an invention of the mind that justifies our desires. Almost all of the global conflicts can be traced back to the selfish impulse to put our needs over others. An us versus them mentality is the natural conclusion of dualism. By its nature, duality demands that when one pole manifests itself, its opposite must be suppressed. A family divided against itself will fall. To see the 10 Sefirot as 10 separate entities is to miss the underlying belief that all are one. This is why most of us don't really start to study Kabbalah until we're into our middle age. When we've experienced one generation making the same mistake as the last, we're usually well versed enough in the wisdom of the world to study it all more intimately. Next time, we'll talk about the 4 rivers in Eden and see why even the 10 are swimming in one channel. Y'all are dope, though. Deuces.